Hello and welcome. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm Managing Editor of Australia Institute Press, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to latest edition of Australia's Biggest Book Club. I'm coming to you from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I'm very grateful to the custodians who have looked after this place for many, many millennia and continue to do so. Just a reminder that you can register for upcoming book clubs and all of our webinars on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. You can type questions for Jess at any time using the Q&A box. The Q&A box and not the chat, please, otherwise we might not see it. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, otherwise we'll boot you out. And finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available shortly after the webinar on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. So perhaps an introduction is a bit unnecessary for someone who has had such a huge role in Australian public life and thought leadership recently, but I'm going to do one anyway. Jess Hill is an investigative journalist and author of See What You Made Me Do, which won the Stella Prize, and the quarterly essay, The Reckoning. She's been a producer for ABC Radio and a journalist for Background Briefing and Middle East correspondent for the Global Mail. Her reporting on domestic abuse has won not one, but 2 Walkley Awards, an Amnesty International Award, and 3 Our Watch Awards. See What You Made Me Do was also an Australian Book Association's Booksellers' Choice Adult Nonfiction Book of the Year. And we're here to talk about her latest quarterly essay, Losing It: Can We Stop Violence Against Women and Children? Welcome, Jess.
Thank you so much, Alice.
So I wanted to start off talking about your practice as a journalist and as an author. And as a podcast host and an award-winning book writer, how do you start to tell a story as complex and hotly contested as domestic abuse? And how do you start to create some of those connections with your interlocutors, with academics, with frontline workers, with victim survivors and policymakers?
Well, I guess and also just to preface that I'm coming from Bidjigal land today, and apologies for any background hum. I'm at UNSW today. I guess the start of it was so long ago now, or it's a decade ago, which in the gendered violence sector still makes me something of a rookie. But so back when I first started, I did have to establish those connections anew. And I guess in establishing those connections, I was also really trying to download people's knowledge and understanding and trying to establish an understanding myself of something that I knew very little about. So we're talking back in 2014. Rosie Batty was about to be made Australian of the Year. There was only just really a burgeoning sense of interest in gendered violence from the Australian public. Now, in the years since, I've become almost like a part of the fabric of the gendered violence sector, of the adjacent sort of community and population of lived experience victim survivors. And so because I'm so embedded now, a lot of these, when I'm doing something like Losing It, this latest from the quarterly essay, I'm picking up existing connections that I've made at speaking events, at seminars. I mean, I've done almost 400 across the country over the past decade. So I've met and befriended so many people across this sector. I've read their works for years. Some of them are dear friends. So in a way, when I first start to tell a story, I'm able to choose from a mental Rolodex of people that I've had the privilege of getting to know and whose work I've got to know intimately. And I go through and I decide who is best to illuminate this. Now, everybody who I spoke to in terms of the lived experience for the quarterly, they were people mostly who I had not met before. And so a lot of what I do up front with victim survivors and their family members and the family members of perpetrators, as was, you know, present much more in this essay, is to establish trust, and a sense of collaboration. So I don't want to come in a power over sort of way and say, I'm going to report your story. You're going to give me all the most intimate and sometimes most shameful parts of your life. I'm then going to choose and select according to the story I want to write, and then you'll find out about it on publishing day. I make it very clear that right up front, we are collaborating on this together. And I'd like to know what parts of their story support the sorts of changes they'd like to see. So what parts of the story are the most useful for people to understand? And what parts of those stories mean the most to them? I think we've very far moved on from what used to be, if it bleeds, it leads. In this area, it used to be that most stories about gendered violence would lead with the most horrific event that had happened. It was like a showstopper, and the reader could gasp and feel shocked and feel drawn in a sort of almost true crime sort of way. I think for the most part, I try to lead into stories with much more subtlety, because actually it's in the subtlety where a lot of victim survivors or family members of those, or family members of perpetrators, that's where they experience this, is in the subtlety, in the in-between. So that's, I guess, yeah, that's where I come from, Alice, on that.
Mm. And something I really admire in your writing generally, but in the quarterly essay in particular, is the way that you balance a really engaging tone. You know, you address the reader directly, for example, but you're also talking about statistics, about facts, and you're relating these kinds of stories. How do you approach that kind of balance? Is it something that happens over the course of the drafting process? Does it evolve over time, or does it come out that way?
Really good question. So I have to say it changes every time. I have a pathological resistance to being bored. And so and I apply that to my own writing. So if I read back something I've written a week later and I find myself sort of like switching off, then that's got to go. Now for this quarterly, because quite unusually, I was critiquing other people in the sector. So as a journalist, for me, at least, the most comfortable position is to speak truth to power, right? And a power that is perhaps seen as adversarial to human rights, for example. What's extremely uncomfortable is when you're critiquing people who are otherwise doing good work. And so my, I guess, nervousness and discomfort in doing that carried into the writing in such a way that when I submitted the first draft to my publisher, I was like, this reads like a policy document, because I have been so careful to try to not mischaracterize or misrepresent anybody's work that I haven't actually come at this like a journalist. I haven't told a story. I've just made sure all the dot points are in order. So actually it was in the second drafting, which, you know, dear listener, was quite close to deadline. Do not follow my example. I had to write at a very fast rate to make this a story, you know, not just make this an accounting of events and policies. But I often write in cafes. I know a lot of people do now, in fact, and I'm sure cafe owners would like that to happen a lot less. But I write in cafes because I want to be surrounded by a feeling of a readership. And I want to be reminded, and I'll often look up, you know, while I'm writing, look around the room. What does this person want to read about? How do I connect to this person? Because otherwise it can feel a bit like we're writing for ourselves. And I think especially when you're writing about gendered violence, my mission really since I started was to reach people who otherwise would have no interest in this subject, and to write for them, as well as the people who are really interested and very much across this whole area. So writing for the reader who is close to disinterested with no existing knowledge, and also for the reader who is expert, that's a hard thing to pull together. But you've got to infuse every sentence with respect for both and a consciousness for both. So that's what I try to do. But I'm also aware that the majority, well, first of all, the majority of Australians, as we know, have experienced child maltreatment. It's like 2/3. So anyone who's writing is writing for an audience who's likely to have experienced child maltreatment, for starters. In this area of writing, I'm also writing for an audience that disproportionately has experienced gendered violence themselves. So when I'm introducing a story, especially one that has quite a lot of difficult detail in it, I'm very conscious of how much detail I go into, how much detail is appropriate and useful without pulling any punches and without self-censoring, but not overloading people and making people feel like this is too difficult for me to read. So it's a really delicate balance, because I don't think that we should shy away from difficult detail, but it shouldn't be gratuitous either.
I think you've done an extraordinary job of walking that line. Um, I was hoping you could talk us through the change the story role in Australian domestic abuse policy, and talk a bit about foregrounding of primary prevention in the landscape that we're in at the moment.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I want to preface this with the fact that back in 2010, which is when we first, when Australia first had a national plan for reducing violence against women and children, it was an incredibly bold and ambitious target to basically say we're going to change the social conditions in which violence is most likely to thrive. So we're going to change attitudes. We're going to improve, more formal markers of gender equality. We're going to educate young people about respectful relationships. This was a very ambitious and unusual position to take for Australia. And Change the Story came along about 5 years later. So in 2015, Change the Story, it was like an evolution on from other documents that have been produced by the Victorian health sector, Vic Health, for example, which really talked about needing to give a lot more primacy to what's called primary prevention, which is typically thought of as a whole of population approach to basically what I just explained, which is to change attitudes and behaviors, and do so through social messaging, through education, through changing policies and structures, changing the very social conditions in which we live. Now, Change the Story as a prevention framework, it is essentially Australia's national prevention framework. It informs a lot of what governments do in terms of what they classify as prevention. It informs funding decisions. It's used to underpin prevention strategies, and it's also used by the sector, although not universally, to guide their prevention efforts. What it did at the time, which was described as world leading, is it separated risk factors, which traditionally in a lot of other prevention frameworks, for example, ones that have been put out by the World Health Organization, Prevention Collaborative, and other sort of global organizations, they would have risk factors sort of grouped together across a socio-ecological model, which looks at what are risk factors at an individual level, what are risk factors at a relationship level, risk factors at a community level, and then risk factors at a society level. So a risk factor at an individual level might be something like experience of child maltreatment, substance abuse, etc. A risk factor at a societal level may be, for example, low deterrent, as in a weak criminal justice system, just to give you a sense of that spread without going into detail across all of those areas. What Change the Story did was essentially separate out what they called the 4 gendered drivers and separate them from other risk factors. That was different to what other prevention frameworks have traditionally done, which is put them all across the spectrum. And so it said that really, in order for us to see violence reduced in Australia, we need to target the gendered drivers, which is a lot about attitudes towards violence and other such drivers. We need to separate those out from the more individualized risk factors, such as substance abuse, what they say, the things that weaken pro-social behavior, which I guess you could be gambling into that, or problem gambling into that, child maltreatment, and etc. Now, they were clear that you need to be attending to both areas, but you need to prioritize work on the 4 gendered drivers. And I think for me, that was an error. I think that it was an error to separate and create a hierarchy of what was most important to focus on for a number of reasons. One of which was this was, and everybody was happy to say so at the beginning, very, very long-term and unpredictable work. This was a hypothesis, as Our Watch was happy to say back in 2016. This was something that was evidence-based but experimental. No other country has done this. No other country has led with a prevention framework that goes for the gendered drivers separately as the most important target, tries to change the way that Australians think and behave. That it's almost a type of social engineering project that's government funded. And I think separating that from the other known risk factors for gendered violence, particularly child maltreatment, and essentially saying that those are just reinforcing factors underneath the gendered drivers, that as long as you change the gendered drivers, improve the gendered drivers, that then this will, remove or ameliorate the impact of these reinforcing factors, that then we would see reductions in violence. I think that was an error. And I think what it's led to, certainly I don't think intentionally, but what it's led to is those areas being deprioritized. And over time, issues like child maltreatment and the intergenerational transmission of violence, issues like problematic alcohol use, issues like gambling, they have become almost unspoken in the area of prevention. And we've set a very ambitious target, some might say unachievable. Every government in the country has said we are going to end gendered violence in a single generation. Now, that is incompatible with the notion that we should prioritize primary prevention, whole of population approaches, which is openly, conceded could take generations to change. If those attitudes change at all. We've seen some improvements in attitudes. We've seen some devolution in attitudes. I don't think I need to tell anyone on this call that we've seen a devolution in the attitudes of some young men from Gen Z, and that's not the fault of Change the Story, but it reflects the fact that unless you live in communist China, you don't hold the levers of culture. We can't shut out the world and construct a biosphere in which we, through education or through our messaging or through our good intentions, even through legislative change, we can't control Australian people's attitudes. We are living in an increasingly globalized world. Our attitudes are increasingly formed by the groups that we and the milieu that we engage with online. Maybe back in 2010, when our milieu and our values were mostly informed by our local environment and a homogenized news media, there was the sense that one could, if one was able to better train journalists, if one was able to reach schools and do a whole of school approach where you inculcate gender equality across the school and bring in respectful relationships programs, etc. If you could create this whole of community type approach, that you could really change the values and attitudes, particularly of young Australians. But we don't hold those levers anymore, not at all. And as the facts have changed and as society has changed, I think our approach needs to change with it. And we need to be attending to the very real problems that we're now facing, which is an accounted for increase in adolescents using sexual violence against other under 18-year-olds, where they are now the primary child sex offenders, have overtaken adults. We've seen in soon to be announced results from the ACMS, there's been other research into intimate partner violence among young people, which shows that that is not diminishing either. Now, this is the generation that has more than any other been exposed to now around 15 years of a national plan to reduce violence. It's been, respectful relationships education in various forms has been used across the country. It's been mandated in Victoria, but it has been in place across the country. You talk to people in universities and they say the students coming through now can quote consent definitions chapter and verse. And yet sexual violence is increasing among that cohort. So I think that the emphasis on attitudinal change and even on changing the structures that underpin gender equality have not been so much misplaced as are delivering diminishing returns.
There's so much material in there. It's hard for me to decide which direction to go in next. One thing I wanted to ask you about, it follows on from some of your points about trauma. And one of the people that we have the pleasure of meeting in the book is Cheryl Batchelor, who's an Aboriginal woman who was inspired by the concept of neuroplasticity, and she's taken that into her work with young people. Can you talk a bit about your thinking on trauma and also what you learned from speaking with Cheryl Batchelor?
Sure. Yeah, Cheryl's remarkable. And she's really working with those kids for whom that they are deemed too complex, too dangerous. They are just bounced around from one system to the next. And inevitably they end up in the youth detention system. And then they're just sort of, that is often a trajectory that then they follow through into adulthood. And what Cheryl does is she's not even really focused on trauma per se. She's focused on brain health. She's like, the experiences that you have had in childhood, whether it be child sexual abuse, exposure to violence, growing up with coercive control, neglect, whatever it may be, that they have impinged and restricted your brain health. But what we know and what we've gathered from neuroplasticity, which is one of the most sort of like optimistic fields that's opened up over the last few decades, is that this can be attended to, that children and young people and adults can be taught to re-regulate, can be taught to reattach to one another. And that's especially important. We've had victim parents, victim mothers who have, for various reasons, for the threat that they were experiencing, for the violence that the whole family was being faced with, have ended up with attachment problems with their children. And often you're seeing these kids, too often you're seeing these kids using violence in the home as a way of gaining some control over an uncontrolled situation, as a way of gaining some safety and authority in an environment in which they have felt utterly powerless. And what Cheryl will do is work with, particularly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, but also with their parents or with their protective parent, with elders, will bring them together and help them learn how to regulate themselves in space with each other. So one example is this Made by Mob event that they do on Friday nights. And essentially she brings together victim, survivor, child, and parent, and they will make a table together, and they'll be assisted by a carpenter. Now that sounds lovely, except for anyone who maybe has a difficult teenager, thinking about, a teenager using an axe, using a saw, using a hammer, So these are all practices that bring up a feeling of danger, a feeling of threat, a feeling of impatience, all the things that this child and parent need to re-regulate, not just for making the table, but in their everyday life. And it's through these practices that you can literally rewire the brain and reattach the child and parent to get back into that safe and loving environment. That is so fundamental. This need for us to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of violence and of shame is, I think, the most important nation building exercise we could embark on. Now, the federal government, after the rapid review into prevention, which was something I sat on last year with 5 others, it became really evident through that process. We spoke to so many stakeholders, as we call them, but groups that what was largely ignored in this is children and young people. And in the response to that rapid review, the government said that they would consult more broadly to see how they can improve responses. They've invested around 80 million or so into an immediate injection into this area. But let me tell you, and I know we don't have long before questions, but we've focused for the past 10 years on education. We've said what we need to do is educate young people about respect and about how to respect each other in relationships. I have a thought exercise that I run in the quarterly, which says, what if in one of those modules, we told children about what kind of help there might be awaiting for them if they were to disclose they were experiencing abuse or they were perpetrating the abuse themselves. It's like, if you're under 18 and you're using violence, I'm sorry, there's not really much help for you. There's no programs, there's no, that we don't really talk about intimate partner violence for under 18-year-olds at all, despite the fact that 15 to 19 is the highest risk age group. If you are experiencing violence at home and your protective parent or your victim parent cannot leave or won't leave, well, you can't go into a refuge. So I'm sorry, you're going to have to try to find a youth refuge, which, to the most extent will only accommodate you for a few weeks at a time. So you're going to have to try to find accommodation, perhaps with someone older, perhaps with other family friends. Some young people, many young people, are having to trade survival sex for a couch. You have 40,000 young homeless people between 12 and 24 every year. You have half of them being turned away from refuge. They are unaccompanied. So what are we doing for those people? What are we doing for them when they get into intimate partner violence in their teens and then end up on a trajectory that goes into adulthood where they have children with their perpetrators and then end up faced with family court, etc.? If your mother has experienced violence and she is finding it difficult to move away from the perpetrator or has used alcohol as a coping mechanism or drugs, maybe child protection will be called, particularly if you're a First Nations child. And then maybe they will do something to work with your mother, but probably not. There'll probably be a lot of fear around you being removed. If you're removed, maybe you'll be lucky enough to find a foster parent that gives you the love and care and affection that you need. Maybe you'll be lucky enough for your victim parent to be able to actually regain custody of you, or maybe you'll end up in temporary alternative accommodation where you're being bounced around from Airbnb to motel to caravan, looked after by temporary labor hire. I just think that we have so thoroughly neglected the experiences of children and young people who have experienced violence and the needs of those children and young people, not to mention what happens in family court and young people being forced and ordered by the family court to live with parents whom they have disclosed against, who may be abusing them under those custodial arrangements, who, if they run away, can be pursued by Australian Federal Police and returned to that abusive custodial parent under court order. I find this whole situation completely shocking, and I'm not even covering it in details. I'm sure people in the chat will be noticing there is so much more you could talk about, the ways in which children and young people's needs are not just neglected, but thoroughly abused by government systems. So the interpersonal violence is one thing that we have to deal with, but the systems violence is a whole nother story altogether. And until governments actually commit to ending the violence perpetrated by their own systems, we won't see not just an end to gendered violence in Australia, we won't see a reduction to gendered violence, because the intergenerational transmission of trauma is not just what young people experience in their homes. It's what they experience from the systems that say they are going to help them, but so often don't.
Thank you. And in the book, you go into some really interesting detail about how much this incredibly dysfunctional system costs. So it's not just that it's working very poorly, in some cases disastrously, but also how much we're paying for that system.
I mean, this is a thing, like child removal, which is not, I mean, a lot of people think that children are only removed in really extreme situations. That's just not the case. And child removal, the very first instance of removal costs $400,000, right? There's an example in the book, Natalie Siegel-Brown, who's advised the UN, but also the Fijian government on how to overturn the rescue and removal paradigm in child protection, which is not to say that sometimes in extreme circumstances, you do need to remove a child. There's no way for that child to be safe with that parent. However, the story that Natalie Siegel-Brown relayed to me about one regional executive manager of child protection who decided, because she had $2 million that was unattached to any particular program, she basically went rogue and decided to say to her workers, I want you to go into these 10 households where the children are slated for removal and see if there is something we can do, some way of intervention or support to avoid that removal occurring. In 9 out of 10 cases, removal was avoided, and the children did not come back into contact with the child protection system. Now, on average, avoiding removal cost about $75,000 per family. And just one example to give you a sense of how unnecessary removal can be, there was an Aboriginal boy he was disabled. He was living with his grandmother. His grandmother was experiencing some issues with dementia. It was not impeding on her emotional attachment and care for him, but it was making it difficult for her to remember to feed and medicate him appropriately. So he was slated for removal. All they did was bring in a nurse twice a day to feed and medicate him on time, and that removal was avoided. And that attachment that he had to his grandmother was preserved. This is not rocket science. And the government knows the economics do not stack up, that when you remove children from loving caregivers who just actually need a bit more support in order to be functional and give the sorts of care that they need to, that you are setting up a possible trajectory into youth detention. They're so common, they now call them the crossover kids, from child protection into youth detention. And youth detention, if you're jailing kids, you're looking at $1.3 million a year. There is the economic argument for early intervention and for support for families that are struggling, or for victim parents who are struggling, is so obvious, but our governments are so risk averse, not risk averse in terms of they want to avoid the risk of harming children, because we know that these trajectories are harming children. They're risk averse in terms of being the one who is going to try something different, because the first disaster that happens on their watch is then pegged back to this change in process. What about all the disasters that are happening, the everyday disasters that are happening on their watch right now? I think we need to, and I'm very interested in finding out if the economic argument for this is so clear, if we can save money by early intervention, who is profiting from this broken system? Why is it costing so much? In temporary emergency accommodation where kids are put into Airbnbs, motels, and supervised by rotating labor hire because they can't be accommodated by foster parents, you're looking up to $2 million per year. Now, in 6 years in New South Wales, that system alone, that part of the system, cost $500 million. That's not a small amount in a state budget.
Mm.
That is half of what the domestic violence sector says it needs annually to run. So I just think that there is no question that it's not about fiscal constraints. It's not about a lack of money. The fact is we're spending a lot of money on some very bad outcomes that could be avoided by working smarter, by thinking about support, by thinking about early intervention. And in New South Wales, it's the only government, thanks to the Advocate for Children and Young People, Zoe Cox-Robinson, that has banned temporary emergency accommodation. But we know that this is happening in every state and territory across Australia.
And with really horrible outcomes. So moving to question time now, that's speaking about young people. This question from Judith Cavell asks, most of the discussion about DV and sexual violence against women focuses on younger women and children. What are we learning about the experience of older women?
Well, I mean, older women in terms of sexual violence, we certainly know, I mean, it's a very small percentage of older women who are in aged care, but we know about 50 sexual assaults are reported every week. That's just those that are reported. And I just focus on that because it's a particular point of advocacy from the Older Women's Network. When I was filming Asking for It, we had a sort of round table, a circle of amazing older women advocates who were talking about the fact that in aged care facilities, sometimes the sexual violence is not even reported if the patient or the resident themselves doesn't complain about it. So you think about all those residents with dementia, etc. Even when the sexual assault is known, it is not reported because it's thought that they don't understand what's happening, which is just horrific. And as Judith is saying here, aged care is not just residential. So obviously we also have carers going out into homes as well. Older people are so vulnerable. And the other side of that too is not just the sexual violence, but the elder abuse. And I think as we're seeing this intergenerational transfer of wealth, really hitting its apex over the next couple of decades, the risk for that is even higher, where your adult children are actually your primary abusers, not to mention the elderly women, particularly, who are still in coercive control relationships that they've been in through their entire lives. We've seen a number, and in some years, record-breaking numbers of elderly mothers being killed by their adult sons. And Yumi Lee from the Older Women's Network talks about the fact that because there is so little in terms of perpetrator accommodation, when you have particularly offenders being released from prison, for example, they need to have somewhere to return to. Now, so often they're going back to their parents' house where they're then offending against their parents or their victim parent. It's such an unsafe situation for older women. And there's so much shame, as Catherine Barrett also talks about. There is so much shame in reporting your own child for using violence against you that you hear very little lived experience advocacy about that, because there's a sense of wanting to protect that young person, particularly if when they were a child, they were growing up with violence in the home. There can be a lot of self-blame from older women and older mothers. I think we need to follow the edict that Giselle Pellicot in France set out, which is we need to return the shame to where it belongs. And an amazing young woman in the Quarterly who spoke about this, sort of not on behalf of her mother, but who really talked because she knows that her mother cannot. She talked about the fact that this is not the little boy that you raised. This is now a man who is subjecting you to violence and coercive control and ruining your life. You need to be able to separate the two, but it's extraordinarily difficult for older mothers to do that.
Mm. The next question comes from Catherine McNaughton, who says, your chapter on the added trauma and poverty inflicted by the family court in See What You Made Me Do is a tragic experience of several friends. Is the family court now doing better? And do you have suggestions for recommended improvement?
So I will say the Chief Justice of the Family Court, William Alstegren, has grappled with the horror that goes on in the family court to a far greater extent than his predecessor, Diana Bryant, who basically maintained the fiction that there was nothing to see here. Now, in that grappling, the Chief Justice has initiated a number of different projects, like the Lighthouse Project, which deals with domestic and family violence allegations being made through family law cases. But he's also collected data from the courts about just how frequently family and domestic violence and child sexual abuse features in cases that go through to court hearings. Now, across the entire family law environment, you're looking at about 83% of cases that feature those allegations. Anyone working in the family law sector, or particularly in the DV sector, has known that for a very long time. What that data says is that over time, particularly since the changes in 2006, which mandated mediation like a mediation first approach, a lot of families who may otherwise have ended up in court are sorting out parenting and financial arrangements through mediation, which means that you're left with the cases that cannot be mediated. And what we've seen, I think, as a result, is that the family court has become, by default, a family violence court and a child protection court. But it is not set up to investigate what are often criminal allegations that come up through the process of trying to organize and arrange parenting arrangements. It is the primary playground for perpetrators to perpetuate coercive control. It is extraordinarily expensive to protect your children in this environment, up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, with an average that I hear from victim survivors is around 300,000 plus. And your ability to protect your children is often constrained by the amount of money that you have. Do I think they're doing enough? They have introduced training and education for judicial professionals from the Safe and Together Institute, who are actually equipped to train and educate people adequately. Safe and Together Institute does incredible work around perpetrator mapping and the mapping of perpetrator behavior. I think that has been a big positive. But no, I don't think that that's enough. It still costs. I mean, I'm not going to go into detail about all of the problems that exist in the family court. The fact that some of the most important evidence can be provided by a single expert who may not be qualified in child development or in family violence, who's qualification may be that they're a psychiatrist, but they may have never been trained in all of their qualifications on the issues that they're actually being asked to assess on. The fact that family lawyers, so few of them have an understanding of family violence and yet are being asked to represent people who are literally needing to prove up their allegations in a court of to the family court's standards in order to protect their children from being court ordered to live with or see an abusive parent. There is the independent children's lawyers who so unfortunately too often collude with perpetrators. You've got to understand, one of the most unifying features of perpetrators of domestic and family violence and child sex abuse is a sense of victimhood. They are very persuasive about the fact that they are the ones who have been victimized. Now, maybe in their past, maybe in their childhoods, they were victimized. And in fact, a lot of people are. A lot of perpetrators are. But the sense that they have been victimized by their ex-partner, their grievance is so powerful that they are able to get these other professionals on board to such an extent where you see a complete flip of who is highlighted as the perpetrator and who is highlighted as the victim, which people may know as Darvo. So I'm keen to find out what has happened since the changes to the Family Law Act and the which came into effect last year, which ended the presumption of equal shared parenting, which is really, really important in terms of ending that presumption that abusive parents have, that they are entitled to half care or to equal parental responsibility. And since the education was brought in, some of those judges will never, ever change. But some judges would like to do better, but the evidence they receive is so substandard. There is so much work that needs to be done to make the family court safe for children that it's sort of difficult to know where to start. However, at least there is a Chief Justice who is ready to grapple with this.
Thank you. My screen has just been jumping around because there are so many questions coming in. Here's the one that I was looking at. Amalia Watson wants to ask, how do you interpret the rise in conversations about male rage and emotional dysregulation in the context of gendered violence? And are we paying attention to the right underlying issues?
That's a complex question. Male rage, male grievance, male entitlement. I mean, that's something that we've talked about in the gendered violence sector for a long time. I think male isolation, male shame, unacknowledged shame is really important to bring into this, and the distortions that creates. I think that it's really important to distinguish between sexual violence and domestic and family violence, even though there are, of course, obviously crossovers between the two. When you're having sexual violence outside of a domestic and family violence context, the drivers can be quite different. I think in sexual violence, where it's outside of that domestic and family violence context, and even inside sometimes, that sense of entitlement, narcissism, grievance, a sense that one needs to perform in order to attain or in order to live up to the ideals of masculinity. One needs to be having sex by a certain age. One needs to, we're seeing so many cases where friends, known adolescents, are sexually assaulting their young friends. And as one of the parents in the SBS series that I helped to produce, asking for it, said, how do we protect our kids from their own friends? So there's this, so in the sexual violence front, I think it's quite different. In the domestic and family violence arena, you have people who act with a certain instrumentality. So you have men who are like, I know what I want. I get benefits from acting like this. I know that if I break her down, if I convince her that she doesn't deserve to be loved, that she won't try to leave me for someone else, that she will, and that basically I can create this whole environment in which she feels lucky to even have me no matter what I do. And they can set out their modus operandi, and they use the same thing with every partner. And it's quite calculating and strategic. But I think for the majority of offenders, you're talking about a type of dysregulation which needs control in order to feel safe. For a lot of them, that's come from a childhood of feeling unsafe, feeling shamed, feeling like they were completely out of control. Now, for whatever reason, because you can have 3 siblings in a family who lived with the exact same family circumstances and only one turn out to be violent, there are things around temperament and other things that we cannot test on an MRI as to why certain people are going to go from certain experiences in their life, disempowering experiences, shaming experiences, etc., and then use violence as a way to create a sense of safety. We cannot identify why and who is most likely to do that. But we do see those trajectories. And I think that, Dr. Tracy Westerman, who runs the Julia Institute for Indigenous Psychologists, she talks about the need for increasing distress tolerance about being rejected, distress tolerance about having to compromise, about having disagreements with your partner, about having them hold you accountable. These are the sorts of things that we need to be helping young people build. The notion that they just need to learn how to respect each other more, I think it's not enough. And certainly we see some really great work with like Body Safety Australia, other groups that go into schools, really talking about how do we deal with those situations that make us really angry with a partner, particularly a young partner. What if when they seem to be flirting with another guy, or when they don't do what you ask them to do, or when they're not ready for sex when you are? How do you deal with that distress yourself and not project your sense of unease and your sense of rejection onto the other person by degrading them, by controlling them, by using violence against them, by subjugating them? I think this is really, at the heart of what we need to offer young people, but also older people. So that's, we could talk about this for hours. Every question has about an hour answer in it, but I'll let that go because I know there are some others in the last few minutes.
Yeah, and I will say for a number of the questions in the chat, for example, about the 4 levers of gendered violence, you'll find that if you read the essay, merging a couple of questions in the chat and just a final point to end on. We have a federal election this weekend. There may or may not be a new parliament. What kinds of priorities? Well, first of all, we had a question about how people can speak with their local members about this kind of issue. I think maybe that would be an hour-long answer. But what kinds of moves would you be hoping to see in a new parliament?
What I want Australian politicians of every stripe to take seriously this bipartisan commitment to end violence in a single generation. So let's look at ending violence as a net zero achievement. This does not, if you are trying to get to net zero emissions, you don't just open up a few small solar farms in Canberra or do some pilot solar projects. You have to take on this as a nation building project. Enough of the tinkering at the edges. This needs to be a whole of government approach, bringing in every ministry, not just the Department of Social Services, but health and education. Everyone needs to come to the table. The states and territories need to come to the table in National Cabinet and start making commitments that underline their promise to end violence in a single generation. They made it. They need to live up to it. And I would also say, in order to reflect how this is a priority for the community, I would also plead with think tanks like the Australian Institute, like the Grattan Institute, to bring in gendered violence policy analysts, because we have policy analysts on housing, on so many other issues that are central to what we need to do in Australia within think tanks. We don't have any think tanks paying attention to gendered violence. And what think tanks do, I don't need to tell you, Alice, what think tanks do is they can crunch through data, they get behind what's happening politically, and they can help feed that through to journalists. We don't have that happening at the moment. The DV sector doesn't have time to constantly be doing this for journalists and for politicians. We need independent policy analysts who can dispassionately review the policy in Australia, the policy landscape in Australia, budgets, etc., and advocate for this nation building project that we so badly need.
Thank you, Jess. It's good to end with a call to action. Thank you so much for your generous thoughts and ideas today. And I can't recommend losing it more highly. It's such an extraordinary work. Despite the subject matter, it is incredibly readable and it's so moving. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There were very, very many of them. The next edition of Australia's Biggest Book Club is coming up at the end of May with Tom McElroy. If you're interested in the Australia Institute's research, you can find it all at australiainstitute.org.au. And this weekend, we've got live streams covering the election results. So all your favourites, Amy Ramikis, Richard Dennis, and more. It would be great to tune into that. Thanks so much for coming along, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.